Disowned in front of strangers, I left without a scene and flipped the switch. What followed shocked them and risked making them lose everything. The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of what used to be my son's foyer. 23 years of sacrifice, 23 years of believing that blood meant something, and it all came crashing down with those 7 words. You're no longer welcome in this family. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what Marcus and his precious wife Elena never bothered to learn about the man who'd given them everything. I wasn't just their father. I wasn't just the guy who'd worked 80-hour weeks to pay for their dream wedding, their perfect house, their luxury cars. I was also the one person who could take it all away with a single phone call. Before we dive into this story, let me paint you a picture of what happens when entitled, "Children Bite the Hand That Feeds Them." Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just revenge, it's justice served at exactly the right temperature. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why sometimes the most devastating lesson comes wrapped in the prettiest Christmas bow. My name is Robert Chen, and for the past 2 decades, I've been what you might call a silent investor. While my son Marcus was busy playing the successful real estate developer, while his wife Elena was posting Instagram stories from their Mediterranean villa, I was the invisible force making their fairy tale possible. The mortgage payments, the business loans, the credit lines that kept their empire from crumbling. All of it flowed through accounts they never knew existed, structured in ways that gave me complete control over their financial destiny. You see, I learned something important during my 40 years in corporate finance. Never give away power without keeping a bigger piece for yourself. And when you're dealing with family, especially family that starts taking your generosity for granted, you better have an exit strategy that leaves them questioning every decision they've ever made. Now, you might be wondering how we got to this point. How does a father end up orchestrating the financial destruction of his own son? Well, that story begins 3 years ago, when Marcus first started treating me like an ATM instead of a parent. But it really accelerates on Christmas Eve in a conversation that would change everything. Picture this. I'm standing in their 12,000 square foot mansion, the one I secretly co-signed for, watching Elena arrange imported orchids that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The whole house smells like expensive candles and even more expensive wine. Their friends are scattered around the living room, all of them dripping in designer clothes and discussing their latest European vacations like they're comparing grocery lists. And where am I in this picture? I'm the guy in the corner, nursing a glass of wine that probably costs more per bottle than I spend on groceries in a month, listening to my daughter-in-law explain to her friends why family dynamics can be so challenging during the holidays. Some people just don't understand boundaries, Elena was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they want to sound sympathetic while actually being cruel. They think that just because they're family, they can impose their presence on every occasion. It's really quite exhausting. I knew she was talking about me. Everyone in that room knew she was talking about me. But here's the thing about people like Elena. They're so confident in their little bubble of privilege that they forget other people have ears, have feelings, and most importantly, have the power to pop that bubble whenever they choose. Marcus, my own flesh and blood, just nodded along with her performance. This is the same man who used to call me crying at 2 a.m. when his business was failing. The same man who'd begged me to co-sign loan after loan, promising he'd pay me back when things turned around. The same man who hadn't made a single payment on any of those loans in over 18 months. But that night, something shifted. As I watched him laugh at his wife's thinly veiled insults, as I saw him choose her social status over his own father's dignity, I realized I'd been playing this game all wrong. I'd been the generous patriarch, the supportive father, the silent benefactor. What I should have been was the puppet master pulling the strings. The breaking point came when their friend Jessica, a woman who'd never worked a day in her life but somehow had opinions about everyone else's financial situation, decided to join the conversation. "Oh, Elena, you're so patient," she said, glancing in my direction with barely concealed disdain. "I don't know how you manage it. Some people just refuse to accept when they've outlived their usefulness in a situation. Outlived my usefulness." Let that sink in for a moment. I'd outlived my usefulness to people whose entire lifestyle depended on my continued financial support. People who wouldn't last 6 months without the money I'd been quietly funneling into their accounts for years. That's when Marcus made the biggest mistake of his life. Instead of defending me, instead of standing up for the man who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities I never had, he looked directly at me and said those 7 words that would seal his fate. "You're no longer welcome in this family." The room went quiet. Even Elena looked surprised by the directness of it. But Marcus wasn't done. He was on a roll now, probably feeling emboldened by the audience, probably thinking this was his moment to finally establish dominance over the old man who'd been supporting him for decades. "We've been trying to find a polite way to say this, Dad, but you make everyone uncomfortable. Your stories about the old days, your opinions about how we should live our lives, your constant presence at events where, frankly, you don't fit in. We're building something here, something important, and we need space to do it without constant judgment from someone who doesn't understand our world." Our world. As if their world wasn't built entirely on my foundation. As if every brick in their mansion, every thread in their designer clothes, every drop of wine in their crystal glasses hadn't been paid for with money that flowed from my accounts into theirs. But here's what they didn't understand about me. Here's what 23 years of their entitled behavior had failed to teach them. I wasn't just Robert Chen, the generous father who'd do anything for his family. I was Robert Chen, the man who'd built a fortune by understanding leverage, by recognizing opportunity, and by never, ever making a move without having 5 backup plans. As I bent down to pick up the pieces of that shattered champagne glass, I was already calculating. The mortgage on their house, tied to a complex arrangement that listed me as the primary guarantor. The business loans for Marcus's real estate company, all of them structured through an LLC that I controlled. The credit lines they'd been using to maintain their lifestyle, every single one of them requiring my continued approval. Elena was still talking, something about how family relationships need to evolve, and how sometimes people need to accept new realities. But I wasn't listening to her anymore. I was thinking about numbers, monthly payments, interest rates, contract clauses that most people never bother to read because they trust family to have their best interests at heart. The beautiful irony was that Marcus, for all his talk about building something important, had never actually read the paperwork he'd signed over the years. He'd been so eager to get his hands on the money, so confident that his old man would never cause problems, that he'd signed document after document without understanding what they really meant. Those documents were about to become very, very important. I stood up slowly, brushing glass fragments from my hands, and looked around the room at all these people who'd just witnessed my public humiliation. Some of them looked uncomfortable now, probably realizing they'd just watched a family implode in real time. Others seemed pleased by the drama, the kind of people who feed on other people's pain because their own lives are so empty. But none of them understood what they'd actually witnessed. They thought they'd seen an old man get put in his place by his successful son. What they'd really seen was the moment I decided to stop being generous and start being strategic. "I understand," I said quietly, setting my wine glass down on their granite countertop. "I understand completely." Marcus looked relieved, probably thinking I was going to make this easy for him. Elena was already turning back to her friends, probably planning to turn this into an amusing anecdote about difficult family members. They had no idea that those 2 words, "I understand," were actually a declaration of war. I walked out of that house with my dignity intact and my strategy crystallizing with every step toward my car. The December air hit my face like a wake-up call, sharp and clean after the suffocating atmosphere of their performative Christmas gathering. Behind me, I could hear the party resuming, laughter and conversation flowing like nothing had happened, like they hadn't just severed ties with the man who held their entire future in his hands. The drive home gave me time to think, time to plan, time to appreciate the beautiful irony of what was about to unfold. Marcus and Elena thought they'd won something tonight. They thought they'd finally freed themselves from the burden of pretending to care about the old man who'd been bankrolling their dreams. What they'd actually done was hand me the perfect justification for everything I was about to do. You see, there's a difference between revenge and consequences. Revenge is emotional, sloppy, driven by hurt feelings and wounded pride. Consequences are mathematical, inevitable, the natural result of poor decisions meeting reality. And after 23 years of watching my son make increasingly poor decisions while hiding behind my financial safety net, those consequences were long overdue. My home office became mission control over the next 72 hours. Documents spread across my desk like battle plans, each one representing a different pressure point in their carefully constructed life. The mortgage paperwork alone was a masterpiece of financial engineering, structured in such a way that Marcus thought he owned that house outright, while the reality was far more complicated. 3 years earlier, when they'd first started shopping for their dream home, Marcus had come to me with that familiar combination of desperation and entitlement that I'd grown to recognize. The house they wanted was $3 million. His business was doing well, but not well enough to qualify for that kind of mortgage on his own. The banks wanted a co-signer, someone with serious assets and a proven track record. "Dad, this is it," he'd said, showing me pictures on his phone like a kid showing off a toy he wanted for Christmas. "This is the house where Elena and I are going to build our legacy, where your grandchildren are going to grow up, where we're going to host family gatherings for decades to come." Family gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I'd done more than co-sign that loan. I'd restructured it entirely, creating a complex arrangement where I held the primary note while Marcus made payments on what he thought was a traditional mortgage. The legal documents were clear, even if Marcus had never bothered to read them carefully. In the event of non-payment or breach of certain conditions, ownership would revert to me immediately. Marcus had been making his payments religiously for 3 years, never realizing that those payments were going into an account I controlled, then being forwarded to the actual lender through a process that kept me as the ultimate authority. It was perfectly legal, meticulously documented, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. But the house was just the beginning. Marcus's real estate development company, Chen Properties, existed entirely because of my financial backing. The initial investment, the credit lines, the business loans that had allowed him to purchase and develop properties across the county. All of it flowed through a network of LLCs and partnerships that I'd helped him establish, ostensibly to protect his assets and minimize tax liability. What those structures actually did was give me veto power over every major decision his company made. Marcus was the CEO, the public face, the one who showed up at ribbon cuttings and gave interviews to local business magazines. But I was the one who controlled the money, and in business, money is the only vote that really matters. The beauty of it was that Marcus had never needed to understand the details. His business was thriving, his lifestyle was everything he'd dreamed of, and his old man was apparently content to stay in the background and write checks when needed. Why would he question a system that was working so perfectly? Elena's situation was even more delicious. Her little interior design business, the one she'd started 2 years ago to give herself something to do besides spend money, was financed entirely through a loan I'd guaranteed. She thought she was this independent entrepreneur, building her own empire, when in reality she was playing with house money. My house money. The Instagram posts about her business success, the magazine features about her design aesthetic, the networking events where she presented herself as a self-made woman. All of it built on a foundation that could disappear the moment I decided to call in those loans. But I wasn't going to be crude about this. I wasn't going to show up at their door with foreclosure papers and a smug expression. That would make me the villain in their story, the bitter old man who couldn't handle being excluded. Instead, I was going to let mathematics do the work for me. The first domino fell on December 27th. Marcus's business accountant called him with what must have seemed like a routine question about year-end financial statements. Except, it wasn't routine at all. It was a carefully orchestrated audit of Chen Properties' credit arrangements, triggered by what appeared to be a random review by one of the lenders. Of course, it wasn't random. I'd made a single phone call to my contact at the bank, expressing concern about some irregularities I'd noticed in the company's recent filings. Nothing accusatory, just the kind of due diligence any responsible guarantor might request. The bank was happy to oblige, especially given my long-standing relationship with them and the substantial assets I kept in their care. The audit revealed what I already knew. Chen Properties was over-leveraged, dependent on a complex web of credit arrangements that were all ultimately guaranteed by me. The company looked successful from the outside, but it was essentially a house of cards that required my continued support to remain standing. Marcus called me that afternoon, his voice tight with stress. For the first time in months, he sounded like the son I remembered, the one who used to come to me with his problems instead of treating me like an inconvenience. Dad, there's something weird happening with the business loans. The bank is asking all these questions about our credit arrangements, wanting to see documentation going back 3 years. My accountant says it's probably just routine, but the timing seems strange. I let him talk, let him work himself into a state of anxiety while I maintained the tone of a concerned father who wanted to help. That does sound unusual, son. Are you current on all your payments? Of course I'm current. We've never missed a payment, but they're asking about things like debt-to-income ratios and collateral verification. They want to schedule a meeting next week to review the entire credit facility. The beautiful thing about fear is how it makes people forget their recent behavior. Marcus wasn't thinking about Christmas Eve anymore, wasn't remembering how he'd publicly humiliated me in front of his friends. He was thinking about his business, his lifestyle, his carefully constructed image of success, and how quickly it could all disappear if the banks decided to tighten their requirements. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, I told him, my voice warm with paternal concern. These things happen all the time in business. The important thing is to be prepared, to have all your documentation in order. What I didn't tell him was that the bank's questions weren't random at all. They were specifically designed to highlight the aspects of his credit arrangements that were most vulnerable, the places where his apparent success didn't match the underlying financial reality. Elena's call came 2 days later. Her interior design business was facing a similar review, this one triggered by what appeared to be a routine audit of small business loans. The timing was unfortunate, she explained, coming right after the holidays when cash flow was always tight. Robert, I know things have been difficult between us lately, she said, her voice carrying none of its usual confidence. But I was hoping you might be able to provide some guidance. The bank is asking questions about the loan guarantee you provided when I started the business, and I want to make sure I'm handling everything correctly. The shift in her tone was remarkable. Gone was the condescending woman who'd spent Christmas Eve explaining to her friends how exhausting family relationships could be. Elena was worried, uncertain, suddenly very aware of how much her success depended on my continued goodwill. I listened to her concerns with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world, occasionally offering reassuring comments while she painted a picture of bureaucratic confusion that was actually a carefully orchestrated pressure campaign. The third domino fell on New Year's Eve. Marcus and Elena had planned a lavish party to celebrate their success and ring in what they expected to be their best year yet. 200 guests, a catered dinner, an open bar stocked with premium liquor, and a live band that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. That morning, Marcus received a certified letter from the bank holding his mortgage. It was written in the careful language that financial institutions use when they want to sound professional while delivering devastating news. The letter explained that due to recent changes in his business credit profile, they were requesting immediate verification of his ability to continue making mortgage payments at the current level. The timing wasn't coincidental. Banks don't typically send letters like that on New Year's Eve unless they're responding to specific concerns raised by someone with standing to raise them. Someone like the primary guarantor of the loan, who'd expressed worry about the borrower's changing financial circumstances. Marcus called me 3 times that day. The first call was panicked, the second was desperate, and the third was angry. By evening, he'd figured out that these weren't random coincidences, that someone was systematically questioning every aspect of his financial arrangements. "Dad, I need to ask you something directly," he said during that final call. "Are you behind what's happening with our loans?" The question hung between us like a challenge. I could have denied it, could have played the confused father who didn't understand banking procedures. Instead, I decided it was time for Marcus to understand exactly who he'd been dealing with all these years. "Son," I said quietly, "I think we need to have a conversation about responsibility." "What do you mean by responsibility?" Marcus's voice carried a tremor I hadn't heard since he was a child, caught breaking something valuable. The confident real estate mogul was gone, replaced by a man who was finally starting to understand the precarious nature of his situation. I mean the kind of responsibility that comes with understanding who actually owns what, I replied, settling back in my leather chair. The kind that comes with reading the documents you sign instead of just looking at the dollar amounts. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I could picture him in that mansion, probably pacing around the marble floors I'd paid for, his mind racing through years of financial arrangements he'd never bothered to fully comprehend. "Are you saying you own our house?" he finally whispered. "I'm saying you should read your paperwork more carefully, all of it. The mortgage documents, the business loan agreements, the LLC partnership structures. It's all there in black and white, Marcus. It always has been." The sound he made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "But you're my father. Why would you structure things that way? Why wouldn't you just give us the money outright?" And there it was. The question that revealed everything wrong with his thinking, everything that had led us to this moment. Marcus genuinely believed that being my son entitled him to my wealth without conditions, without respect, without even basic courtesy. He'd never considered that my generosity might come with expectations, or that those expectations might be enforced. Because, son, I've spent 40 years learning that the moment you give someone something for free, they stop valuing it. And more importantly, they stop valuing you. Elena must have been listening on the other line because I heard her voice in the background, sharp and panicked. "What does this mean for the party tonight? We have 200 people coming. The caterers, the band, everything's already paid for. Everything's already paid for." Even in crisis, she was thinking about appearances, about maintaining the illusion of success in front of their social circle. She still didn't understand that their entire lifestyle was an illusion, a performance funded by a man they'd just discarded like yesterday's newspaper. "The party is the least of your concerns," I said calmly. "What you need to be worried about is what happens next Monday when the banks start making decisions based on the information they've been reviewing." Marcus found his voice again, and this time there was an edge of anger mixing with the fear. "This is insane. You can't just destroy our lives because we hurt your feelings at Christmas." Hurt feelings. Even now, even facing financial ruin, he was reducing what had happened to hurt feelings, as if being publicly humiliated and disowned by your own child was just a minor emotional inconvenience that mature people should brush off and move on from. "Marcus, let me explain something to you about cause and effect. For 3 years, you've been making decisions based on the assumption that my support was unconditional. You treated me like an ATM, then like an embarrassment, then like an enemy. Those were your choices. What's happening now isn't revenge, it's mathematics." "Mathematics?" Elena's voice was shrill now, cutting through their expensive sound system. "You're talking about destroying our family over some disagreement about Christmas dinner." "I'm talking about accountability," I corrected. "Something you've both been avoiding for years. Did you think there would never be consequences for your behavior? Did you imagine you could take my money while treating me like garbage indefinitely?" The party sounds in the background were getting louder. Their guests were arriving, probably expecting another evening of champagne and celebration, unaware that they were about to witness the implosion of everything Marcus and Elena had built their identities around. "What do you want from us?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "What do we have to do to fix this?" It was the right question, finally, but it had come about 6 months too late. The time for negotiation had passed when he'd looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer welcome in his family. The time for compromise had ended when Elena had spent years treating me like hired help while living off my generosity. "I want you to understand something very clearly," I said, my voice steady and measured. "Every dollar you've spent, every luxury you've enjoyed, every moment of success you've experienced in the past 3 years has been possible because of my financial backing, not your business acumen, not Elena's design talents, not your hard work or natural ability. My money, my guarantees, my willingness to enable your lifestyle." "Dad, please!" "I'm not finished. You made a choice on Christmas Eve. You chose to publicly humiliate me, to cast me out of the family I'd sacrificed everything to support. You made that choice in front of a room full of people, with full knowledge of how it would affect me. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." Through the phone, I could hear the party reaching full swing. Laughter, music, the clink of expensive glassware, All of it funded by money that could disappear with a single phone call from me. The banks will make their decisions based on current financial realities, I continued. Your business is over-leveraged. Your personal debt-to-income ratio is unsustainable without my continued guarantees. Your mortgage is structured in a way that gives me significant control over the property. These aren't threats, Marcus. These are facts. Elena grabbed the phone. Robert, you're being completely unreasonable. We're family. Families work through disagreements. They don't destroy each other over hurt pride. You're absolutely right, Elena. Families don't destroy each other, which is why it's so interesting that you and Marcus chose to destroy our family relationship 3 days ago. I'm simply responding to the new reality you created. What new reality? She demanded. The reality where I'm no longer your father-in-law. Marcus is no longer my son. And none of us are family anymore. Those were your words, not mine. I'm just adjusting my financial arrangements to match the new relationship status you insisted upon. The music in the background suddenly stopped. Someone had probably turned off the sound system to deal with what was becoming a very public family crisis. I could imagine their guests standing around awkwardly, champagne glasses in hand, trying to pretend they weren't witnessing a complete meltdown. You can't do this, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was starting to understand that I absolutely could do this, and that all his protests and pleading weren't going to change the fundamental power dynamic he'd never bothered to recognize. Actually, I can do exactly this. And here's the beautiful part, son. It's all perfectly legal. Every document you signed, every arrangement we made, every financial structure we put in place was designed to protect both of us. The only problem is that you never bothered to understand what you were signing up for. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus and Elena alternating between anger, bargaining, and desperation. They offered apologies that rang hollow because they were motivated by fear rather than genuine remorse. They promised to change, to be better, to include me in their lives again. But their promises were just more manipulation, another attempt to manage me for their benefit. I listened to it all with the patience of a man who'd finally found his leverage after years of being taken for granted. Every word they spoke just confirmed that I was making the right decision. They weren't sorry for how they'd treated me. They were sorry they were facing consequences. The party ended early that night. According to my neighbor, who lived across the street from their mansion, guests started leaving around 10 o'clock instead of staying until midnight as planned. Word travels fast in their social circle, and nothing kills a celebration like the hosts having a financial crisis in real time. January 2nd brought the first formal notice. Marcus's business line of credit was being called for immediate review, with temporary restrictions placed on new draws until the review was complete. Without access to that credit line, Chen Properties couldn't fund its current development projects or pay its contractors. January 3rd was Elena's turn. Her business loan was restructured with new terms that required monthly financial statements and quarterly reviews. The friendly, hands-off relationship she'd enjoyed with her lender was replaced by intensive oversight that would make it nearly impossible for her to maintain the cash flow her business required. But the real masterpiece came on January 5th. Marcus received a letter that would change everything, delivered by certified mail to ensure there was no question about when he'd received it. The letter was from my attorney, written in the careful language that lawyers use when they want to be absolutely clear about legal consequences. The letter explained that due to recent changes in family circumstances, I was exercising my rights under various loan agreements to accelerate payment schedules and modify terms. It wasn't foreclosure, exactly, but it was something almost as devastating. Marcus and Elena had 30 days to either refinance their obligations without my involvement or accept new terms that would give me even more control over their financial lives. The choice was elegant in its simplicity. They could try to find new lenders willing to take on their debt without my guarantees, which would be nearly impossible given their actual financial position, or they could accept new arrangements that would essentially make them my employees in the businesses they thought they owned. Marcus called me 6 times that day. I didn't answer any of the calls. Elena sent text messages that evolved from pleading to angry to desperate. I deleted them without reading past the first few words. They'd had 3 years to treat me with respect. They'd had countless opportunities to value the relationship instead of just the money. They'd chosen their path, and now they were discovering where it led. The beautiful thing about consequences is how they reveal character. Some people face adversity and discover strength they didn't know they had. They learn from their mistakes, adapt to new realities, and emerge better than they were before. Others collapse under pressure, blame everyone but themselves, and spend their energy looking for someone else to rescue them. Marcus and Elena fell firmly into the second category. Instead of taking responsibility for the choices that had led to their situation, they spent the next 2 weeks trying to find ways around the consequences. They hired lawyers to review the documents they should have read years earlier. They approached other lenders with business plans that looked impressive on paper, but couldn't hide their fundamental dependence on my continued support. Most tellingly, they started a whisper campaign among their friends, painting me as a vindictive old man who was destroying his own family out of spite. The story they told was carefully crafted to make them look like victims of my unreasonable behavior, with no mention of the years of financial support or the Christmas Eve confrontation that had started everything. But their friends weren't stupid. These were successful people who understood business and finance. They could see the difference between a family disagreement and a financial reckoning. More importantly, they could see that Marcus and Elena's lifestyle had never quite matched their apparent income level, and they were starting to understand why. The social consequences were almost as devastating as the financial ones. Invitations stopped coming. Business relationships grew cooler. The networking events and charity galas that had been central to Elena's identity became awkward affairs where conversations died when she approached. It's remarkable how quickly a social circle can turn when they realize someone isn't actually as successful as they'd pretended to be. People who had been eager to associate with the rising stars of local real estate development suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere when Marcus and Elena needed support. By the middle of January, their situation was becoming impossible to hide. Marcus's development projects were stalled because he couldn't access the credit he needed to pay contractors. Elena's interior design business was hemorrhaging clients because she couldn't maintain the inventory and staffing levels that had made her competitive. The house became a symbol of everything they were losing. That 12,000 square foot mansion that had been their pride and joy was now a constant reminder of their dependence on me. Every room they walked through, every luxury they'd taken for granted, every detail that had made them feel successful was actually evidence of my generosity and their ingratitude. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd kicked me out of that house on Christmas Eve, declaring that I was no longer welcome in their family. Now they were discovering that without my welcome, they might not have a house at all. But I wasn't finished with them yet. The financial pressure was just the beginning, the foundation for a lesson that would reshape how they thought about family, respect, and consequences. What came next would be even more devastating, because it would force them to confront not just their financial dependence, but the fundamental character flaws that had made this reckoning necessary. The real education was about to begin. The turning point came on January 18th, when Marcus finally understood that this wasn't a negotiation he could win through charm or manipulation. The realization hit him during what should have been a routine meeting with his largest client, Henderson Development Group, who'd been considering a $50 million project that would have secured Marcus's reputation for years to come. I wasn't in that conference room, of course, but I didn't need to be. The beauty of small business communities is how quickly information travels, especially when it concerns financial instability. Word had reached Henderson's board that Chen Properties was experiencing liquidity challenges, and they wanted reassurance before moving forward with such a substantial investment. Marcus called me that evening, and for the first time in weeks I answered. "They pulled the Henderson contract," he said without preamble. His voice was flat, defeated. 5 years of relationship building, 2 years of planning, and they pulled it because someone told them we were having cash flow problems. "That's unfortunate," I replied, settling into my home office where the documents that controlled his fate were neatly organized across my desk. "Did they say who raised these concerns?" The silence stretched between us. Marcus wasn't stupid, despite his recent poor judgment. He was beginning to understand that my network of business relationships extended far beyond what he'd ever imagined. The same connections that had helped him build his company were now working against him, not through malice, but through simple prudence. "It was you, wasn't it?" he asked finally. "You called Henderson directly." "I didn't need to call anyone, son. The truth has a way of revealing itself, especially in business. When a company's financial foundation is built on someone else's guarantees, and those guarantees become questionable, smart investors notice." Elena's voice came through the background, sharp with panic. "What does this mean for the other contracts? What about the Morrison project, the Riverside development?" I could hear papers rustling, probably Marcus pulling out project files, trying to calculate how many other deals might be at risk. The answer, of course, was all of them. Every major contract Chen Properties had depended on my financial backing in some way, either through direct guarantees or through the credit arrangements that allowed Marcus to bid competitively. "The Morrison project is interesting," I said thoughtfully. "Didn't they require a performance bond worth $3 million? I seem to remember co-signing for that bond application." The sharp intake of breath told me Marcus had forgotten about that particular detail. Performance bonds were insurance policies that guaranteed completion of construction projects. If Chen Properties defaulted on the Morrison development, the bonding company would pay the client and then come after the guarantors for recovery. "Dad, you can't seriously be considering pulling support from active projects. There are families depending on these developments. People have put deposits down for homes that won't exist if we can't finish construction." It was a clever appeal to my conscience, painting himself as the protector of innocent families rather than the architect of his own problems. But Marcus had made a critical error in his reasoning. He assumed I cared more about strangers than I cared about the son who'd publicly disowned me. Those families should probably contact their attorneys," I said calmly. "When a developer can't meet their obligations, there are legal remedies available to protect buyers. It's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to shield your clients from your business failures." "Business failures?" Elena's voice was getting shriller. "This isn't business failure, this is sabotage. You're deliberately destroying everything we've built." "Elena, you built nothing. You spent money that wasn't yours and took credit for success that wasn't earned. The fact that it's disappearing so quickly should tell you something about how substantial it actually was." The conversation continued for another hour, with both of them cycling through every argument they could think of. They appealed to family loyalty, to shared history, to the grandchildren they claimed they wanted to give me someday. They promised changes, offered compromises, suggested therapy to work through our issues. But every word they spoke revealed the same fundamental problem. They still didn't understand that respect isn't something you can negotiate after the fact. They were trying to manage the consequences of their choices rather than accepting responsibility for making those choices in the first place. The real education came 3 days later, when Elena discovered that her interior design business wasn't just facing a credit review. The commercial lease for her showroom, which she'd thought was in her name, was actually structured through one of my LLCs, the same LLC that was now questioning whether the lease arrangement was still appropriate given recent changes in family circumstances. She showed up at my house that afternoon, not calling first, not asking permission, just standing on my doorstep with tears streaming down her face and desperation radiating from every pore. "Robert, please, I'm begging you. The showroom is everything to me. It's not just a business, it's my identity. It's who I am." I looked at this woman who had spent years treating me like hired help, who had orchestrated my humiliation in front of her friends, who had convinced my son that his father was an embarrassment to be hidden away. Now she was standing in my doorway, asking for mercy she'd never shown me. "Elena, help me understand something. When you told your friends at Christmas that some people don't understand boundaries, were you talking about me?" Her face flushed red. I didn't mean... When you laughed along with Jessica's comment about people outliving their usefulness, did you think I couldn't hear you?" "Robert, I was just trying to fit in with the group. Sometimes in social situations, people say things they don't really mean. So you threw me under the bus to impress people who probably don't even like you very much. That's somehow supposed to make me feel better about it?" She was crying harder now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt your feelings. But destroying my business won't change what happened. It will just make everything worse for everyone." "You're right that it won't change what happened." but it will ensure that the consequences match the behavior. For 3 years, you've benefited from my generosity while treating me with contempt. Now, you get to experience what life looks like without that generosity. But the showroom lease isn't just about me. I have employees. Sarah has been with me since the beginning. Jennifer just had a baby and needs her job. You're not just hurting me, you're hurting innocent people. It was the same strategy Marcus had tried, appealing to my conscience by invoking innocent third parties. But Elena had made the same mistake her husband had made. She assumed I would prioritize strangers over the family that had rejected me. Those employees should probably update their resumes, I said quietly. When businesses fail because they're built on unsustainable foundations, the employees are usually the first casualties. It's unfortunate, but it's not uncommon. Elena stared at me like I'd grown a second head. You've changed. The Robert I knew would never be this cruel. You used to care about people, about family, about doing the right thing. The Robert you knew was a fool who confused generosity with love and enablement with support. That Robert spent 3 years being taken advantage of by people who saw him as nothing more than a source of funding. This Robert has learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people experience the consequences of their choices. She left without another word, probably rushing back to tell Marcus that his father had become a monster. They would spend hours analyzing my behavior, trying to understand how the generous man who'd funded their dreams had transformed into someone who seemed determined to destroy them. But they would miss the crucial point, as they'd been missing it all along. I hadn't changed at all. I'd simply stopped pretending that their behavior was acceptable. The generosity had always come with conditions, with expectations of basic respect and gratitude. They'd just never bothered to notice because the money kept flowing, regardless of how they treated me. The showroom closed on February 1st. Elena's carefully curated display of furniture and fabrics, her vision boards and design samples, her awards and professional certificates, all of it packed into boxes and loaded onto trucks. The employees she'd been so concerned about found other jobs or filed for unemployment benefits. The clients who'd trusted her with their home renovations scrambled to find new designers. Marcus's situation deteriorated even faster. Without access to credit, Chen Properties couldn't pay contractors, couldn't purchase materials, couldn't meet the deadlines specified in their development contracts. One by one, clients began invoking penalty clauses and threatening lawsuits for non-performance. The Riverside development, which had been Marcus's signature project, ground to a halt with foundations poured, but nothing else completed. The Morrison project was canceled entirely when Marcus couldn't secure the bonding required for the next phase of construction. 3 smaller residential developments were abandoned at various stages of completion, leaving half-finished houses scattered across the county like broken promises. By mid-February, Marcus had laid off 80% of his workforce. The company that had employed 47 people just 3 months earlier was down to Marcus, his secretary, and 2 project managers who were desperately trying to find ways to salvage something from the wreckage. The psychological toll was evident every time I saw them around town. Marcus, who had once carried himself with the confidence of a successful entrepreneur, now looked hollow-eyed and defeated. Elena, whose Instagram feed had been a carefully curated showcase of luxury and achievement, stopped posting entirely. They'd lost more than their business and financial security. They'd lost their identity, their social standing, their sense of who they were in the world. Everything they'd used to define themselves had been built on my foundation. And without that support, they discovered they had nothing left but each other and the harsh reality of their actual circumstances. The mansion became a monument to their fall from grace. The mortgage payments they couldn't make, the utilities they couldn't afford, the maintenance they couldn't fund. Room by room, the house began showing signs of neglect. The imported orchids Elena had loved so much withered and died. The marble floors lost their shine. The custom lighting fixtures started burning out and weren't replaced. Their friends stopped visiting, partly because the atmosphere had become so toxic, but mostly because Marcus and Elena had become bitter, angry people who blamed everyone but themselves for their situation. Dinner parties became sessions of mutual recrimination. Social gatherings turned into forums for conspiracy theories about how I'd orchestrated their destruction. But the most revealing moment came in early March, when Marcus finally swallowed his pride enough to ask for a meeting. Not a phone call, not a desperate conversation through intermediaries, but a formal request for a face-to-face discussion about resolving our differences. He came to my house alone, looking older than his 35 years, wearing a suit that had probably cost $3,000, but now hung on him like expensive camouflage for a man who no longer existed. "Dad," he said as I opened the door, "thank you for seeing me." I led him to my living room, the same room where we'd had countless conversations over the years about business, family, life, and dreams. The same room where he'd once brought Elena to introduce her as the woman he wanted to marry. The same room where he'd announced their engagement, their business plans, their vision for the future. Now he sat across from me like a defendant facing judgment, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused on the coffee table between us. "I need to ask you something directly," he said finally. "What will it take to end this? What do you want from me to make this stop?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when Marcus finally understood that this wasn't a temporary setback or a negotiating tactic. This was his new reality, and the only question was whether he was ready to accept responsibility for creating it. "What I want, son, is for you to understand cause and effect. For 3 years, you took my support for granted while treating me with increasing disrespect. You let your wife turn me into a joke in front of your friends. You chose their approval over your father's dignity. Those were choices, Marcus. Deliberate decisions about what kind of man you wanted to be and what kind of relationship you wanted with me. I know I made mistakes. You made choices. There's a difference. Mistakes are accidental. Choices have consequences." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes, but also something I hadn't seen in years: recognition, understanding, the beginning of actual accountability. "You're right," he said quietly. "I chose Elena's family over you. I chose their approval over your respect. I chose to believe that your support would always be there no matter how I treated you. And now? Now I understand that everything I thought I'd built was actually something you'd built for me. And when I rejected you, I rejected the foundation that made any of it possible. It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. Not an excuse, not a justification, not an attempt to minimize his responsibility. Just a simple acknowledgement of the choices he'd made and their consequences. The question is, Marcus, what are you prepared to do with that understanding?" He took a deep breath, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw something in his eyes that looked like the sun I'd raised. "Whatever it takes to earn back your respect. Not your money, not your financial support, but your respect. Because I finally understand the difference." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and changed everything between us. Not because I forgave him immediately, and certainly not because I restored his financial support, but because for the first time in years, we talked to each other like adults who understood that relationships require mutual respect, not just shared DNA. Marcus didn't get his old life back. That was gone forever, a casualty of choices that couldn't be undone. But he got something more valuable, something he'd lost without even realizing it. He got the chance to discover who he really was when he wasn't performing for other people's approval. The education was finally complete. The lesson had been learned. And surprisingly, that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a different one entirely. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the ruins of his former showroom office, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the skeletal remains of what had once been Chen Properties. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched him through the window, carefully packing away awards and certificates that now represented nothing more than expensive paper. But something had shifted in those final conversations, something I hadn't expected when I'd first decided to teach him about consequences. Marcus wasn't the same entitled man who'd disowned me at Christmas. The financial devastation had stripped away every layer of pretense, every carefully constructed identity he'd built around other people's money. And what remained was someone I barely recognized, someone I actually respected. Elena had filed for divorce in April, blaming Marcus for the collapse of their empire rather than accepting her own role in creating it. She'd moved back to her parents' house in Portland, taking with her nothing but resentment and a complete inability to understand how her actions had contributed to their downfall. Even in defeat, she remained the same person who'd called me exhausting at that Christmas party. Marcus, however, had surprised me. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or plotting revenge, he'd done something I never expected. He'd gotten a job. Not as a CEO or development director or any other title that would let him maintain the illusion of his former status. He'd taken a position as a project manager with Henderson Development Group, the same company that had pulled their $50 million contract from Chen Properties. The salary was probably 1/10 of what he used to make. The work was hands-on, unglamorous, the kind of construction management he'd avoided for years while playing the role of visionary entrepreneur. But when I drove past the job site where he was working, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Marcus looked genuinely happy. He called me on a Tuesday evening in late May, his voice carrying a lightness I'd forgotten existed. "Dad, I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to teach me." "And what's that, son?" "That respect isn't inherited, it's earned, and that the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or opportunities or even love. It's the chance to discover their own strength." The conversation that followed was the first real talk we'd had as father and son in over 3 years. Not as creditor and debtor, not as benefactor and dependent, but as two men who'd both learned difficult lessons about pride, family, and what actually matters in life. Marcus had moved into a modest apartment across town, driving a used Honda instead of his former luxury sedan. He was dating a teacher he'd met at a coffee shop, someone who knew nothing about his previous wealth and didn't care about his current lack of it. He was building something real for the first time in his adult life, something that belonged entirely to him. "I need to ask you something," he said toward the end of our call. "And I want you to know that however you answer, it won't change anything between us. But I have to ask." "Go ahead." "The house, the business, all of it, is it really gone forever? Or was this all just the most elaborate lesson in family dynamics ever created?" I smiled, looking out at my garden where I'd been spending more time lately, growing vegetables instead of resentment. "Marcus, what would be the point of giving it all back? Would you want to return to being the man you were 6 months ago?" "God, no. That man was miserable and didn't even know it." "Then you have your answer." The assets were gone, liquidated through various legal mechanisms to pay debts and settle obligations. The house had been sold to a family that would actually appreciate it. The business equipment and intellectual property had been purchased by competitors who could use them more effectively. But the money those sales generated didn't disappear into my accounts. Instead, it went into something Marcus discovered 6 months later when he received a letter from an attorney he'd never heard of. The letter explained that an anonymous benefactor had established an education fund in his name, specifically designed to help young entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds start their own businesses. The fund would provide microloans, mentorship, and business education to people who had great ideas but lacked the connections and capital to bring them to life. Marcus would serve as the program director, drawing a modest salary while helping others avoid the mistakes he'd made. The irony was perfect. The man who'd once taken family support for granted would now spend his career teaching others how to build something sustainable from the ground up. When he called me after receiving that letter, he was crying. "You could have just given me another chance," he said through tears. "You could have restored everything and let me try again." "Son, I gave you something much more valuable than another chance. I gave you the opportunity to become someone worth respecting, including respecting yourself." Today, as I write this, it's been 2 years since that Christmas Eve confrontation that changed everything. Marcus runs the entrepreneurship program with the passion of someone who truly understands the value of building something real. He's married to Sarah, the teacher, and they're expecting their first child in the fall. Elena still lives with her parents, still convinced that she was the victim of my unreasonable behavior. She started an Instagram account dedicated to exposing what she calls financial abuse by toxic family members. Her posts get very few likes, and me? I've discovered that the best revenge isn't destroying someone's life. It's giving them the chance to build a better one, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it. The villa Marcus and Elena lost is now owned by the Rodriguez family. Immigrants who saved for 15 years to buy their dream home. Their children play in the same backyard where Marcus once planned to host parties for people who never really liked him anyway. Sometimes the most devastating lesson comes wrapped in the prettiest bow. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that lesson transforms into the greatest gift you could ever give someone, even when that someone is the child who broke your heart on Christmas Eve. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt taken for granted by people you've supported, if you understand that sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their choices, then you know why I had to share this. Because family isn't about blood or obligation or who owes whom what. Family is about respect, gratitude, and understanding that every relationship requires investment from both sides. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is teach someone that lesson, no matter how much it costs both of you to learn it.